Hello again, everybody, and welcome to a very special, and I say that every week, but you know they always are, edition of the Jim Cornette Experience. Today on the Cultcast, updates on all of my current projects, a little politics, but a lot of wrestling, some old wrestling, some new wrestling, because we're going into viewer mail, where you pick the topics, and then I disseminate the edumacation. To join me in this, plus with hilarious banter from my co-host, as we all know, and here he is now, ladies and gentlemen. It gets longer every week. Hawaiian Brian, the podcasting lion, the king of the Arcadian Vanguard Podcast Network, Mr. Co-host to you. He's Swammy's pappy, the post office playboy, Susie's favorite boy, the French toast chapeau maitre d', the great Brian Lass.
I own the French toast chateau. I'm not the maitre d'.
Well, oh, goddamn, you know some maitre d's are the owners. They just dress up in the tux and go out there to save the fucking salary. How are you anyway?
I'll say aloha to all the listeners out there. Hello, it's great to be here once again. And I did have a nice plate of French toast the other day, actually. I posted it on Twitter, and people went
You sent out a picture of you eating at IHOP, eating French toast and French fries. Who eats what? What are you? Do you worship Jerry Lewis? What other kind of French things are you into?
I have to say, this says a lot about how lost in the conversation about French toast you were whenever we had it a couple weeks ago. Because I said during that conversation, I'll have French toast and French fries and a side of sausage and a coffee and an orange juice. And you just completely forgot about that.
Well, It just visually, when I saw the picture, it just was like, that's a lot of carbs and bread and potato with no meat.
Well, it's not like I'm doing it all the time. Every now and then. I mean, when I was younger, I could do it as much as I wanted. It was amazing. But now,
Well, you can say that about a lot of things, but exactly. We're not going to talk about all of that.
But now every several months, maybe I'll treat myself to an old school breakfast.
Oh, I thought you were talking about every several months. Never mind. Anyway, an old school French toast and French fries, an old school. But I don't know what old school you went to.
Brian, old school. It's old school Brian, I'm saying.
Oh, for fuck's sake. I'm going to watch out. Do we have any fans in Paris, over in France?
Yes, actually, we do have listeners.
Or as Bill Mercer may say, over in Norwegia, over in French. Is this French toast, is this legitimate, or is this like Taco Bell's not really Mexican food? Is the French toast that we get here in this country, is that a legitimate thing in French France?
I don't think French fries or French toast are legitimate French
Well, I know
items.
French fries aren't, or even freedom fries. And boy, then the French turned out to be right, and we had fucking fries on our face. But I know French fries are not necessarily French, but is French toast a thing they eat in France?
I don't think so. That's my guess. I don't think so.
Well, then what the fuck are you doing perpetuating this goddamn stereotype against the French people? I got enough problems with the French Canadians, who are generally quite prickish, I might say, from the fucking dealings I've had, at least away, except for Pat Patterson.
He wasn't dickish? Pat Patterson isn't dickish?
No, prickish, I said. Well, nevertheless, Pat Patterson is the nicest French Canadian person that I've ever met. I'll just tell you that right now. Anyway, a good heaven, and this is a rotten segue, but we do it at the top of the program. Last week, we were in the time warp and did not mention the passing of Jose Lothario, and wanted to do that now. Now we have to do it out of French toast foolishness, but what was he, 83 years old?
Yeah.
And once again, he's another guy that a lot of people just might have seen when he had the little run with Shawn Michaels there as his trainer, which he was, and his mentor, which he had been in the WWF in 96, and the thing with me and Vader. But that's not seeing Jose Lothario, and I didn't even really get to see the prime in-ring Jose Lothario live, because that was, he was on top pretty much as soon as he got into business, but that was the late 50s. But during the 60s and early 70s especially, as the Houston programs, he was huge in Houston. And I know a lot of people say, oh, well, just one town or whatever. No, he worked California, Southern California, and the entire Texas territories, and Florida. He was big in Florida, but just in Houston, he really was like God there for quite a while and was the number one babyface. And Dusty had seen him in those days, and Dusty put in his book, and people had quoted that Dusty Rhodes considered Jose Lothario the best working babyface that he had ever seen, because he had not only had the fire and the punches, because he had been a boxer, but he had the psychology, and he could work and knew how to sell but come back and fight and the whole 9 yards. So that was what Dusty's compliment meant, was he was the best working babyface he'd ever seen. But then I got to see not only, videotapes after the fact, but then also when we first went to Mid-South, Jose was still working down in Texas some, and we got a chance to work with him in Houston a couple times, and it was insane, because he still, even, 20 years after his peak, had the people, and then, whoever, I think it was Hector Guerrero and El Bracero we worked with one time, but whoever his partner was would do the job, obviously, in those days. But anyway, and it was fun working with Jose. It wasn't fun working with Jose and Sean, but it was fun working with Jose. In 96, I wish I'd been in better shape. I stretched the limits of my spandex wrestling attire to its very essence. Because I had like 2 months notice, maybe not even then. They booked the pay-per-views from month to month in those days. So they were like, well, next month we'll have you and Jose run. I'm like, fuck. Because I was huge, just plain big. But he would throw that punch and never touch you. And it looked like it killed you, and, the whole 9 yards. So I just wanted to say something in case people thought that I just glossed over it and didn't, wasn't going to mention it. But Jose Lothario, another guy that was huge in the territory days and had those talents. And he was not only big with the Hispanic audience, but also in Florida, you had it wasn't the Mexican Hispanic audience, it was the Puerto Rican Hispanic audience, and sometimes they don't like each other, and he was still over then, and was over with all the farmers and rednecks and etc. So he was just a good fiery babyface.
I just talked with Peter Burkholz from Houston Wrestling on the Superpodcast. I'll mention more about it later on during my parade of plugs. But we did a couple segments on Jose Lothario, and he brought up, we talked a little bit about the fact that Jose Lothario was so important to getting Gino Hernandez over.
Oh, God, yeah.
I mean, Jose, he actually was taking Gino to Mexico when he was a teenager to teach him how to work and get him work before he was legally allowed to wrestle in Houston.
And then that was the program when the, established veteran superstar babyface Jose Lothario got fucked around by the young, cocky Hispanic heel Gino Hernandez, and they drew tons of money down there. And that kind of kicked Gino off, too.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's a shame, but 83, we can all keep our fingers crossed. We make that, milestone, right?
Super Sock, my favorite nickname.
Super Sock. And boy, it was. Boom. Anyway, and Michael Hayes stole the left, by the way. That was Michael Hayes, and he admitted that in public last week also, but the left was Jose's that he used to use. Only Jose didn't really knock people fucking sideways and goofy with it. Anyway, no, I digress. I've said I wasn't going to mention this person's name, and I'm not going to mention any names, but I heard a real stupid fucking quote this week, from the person who now has gotten so desperate and is apparently penniless. He's unhireable and nobody cares, and he can't get a fucking job. And he tries to leech off of my incredible popularity here with the cult by constantly talking about me, but I don't mention his name anymore. But that person, who I think everybody knows, actually said this, apparently in a public forum of some description. This was reported to me by someone else because, I do not listen to that voice. But now the story is, Brian, I don't really hate him. I don't really hate him. It's just that the devil has chosen me to discredit him in his attempts to bring the word of God to the world.
I think he may be onto something.
So apparently now he either thinks he's Jesus Christ or Donald Trump, and I'm the heel. So there you go, folks, once again. And I don't know why so many people in so many various fields that have come in contact with this fucking sphincter attempt to discredit him and shoot his shit full of holes and say that he's full of bullshit, and every time he opens his mouth, shit and lies fall out. When you get pithy comments like that are obviously verifiable facts, and verifiable by the fact that I do have 666. It's very small, but the doctor found it. 666 is right on the side of my asshole, right on the side of the sphincter there. And I encourage this individual that I'm talking about to look at it himself someday, and he will know for sure that I am a chosen one of the devil.
It's always that damn devil.
But you know how you can beat the devil? I'll tell you how you can beat the devil. You can beat the devil by celebrating Christmas. How can you celebrate Christmas? At JimCornette.com and the Cornette's Collectibles 2018 holiday sale. Because after all, for the wrestling fan in your family, the wrestling fan in your social circle, the wrestling fan that you'd like to bang, the wrestling fan that you want to get back in good with after you've pissed them off some kind of way, all of those people, there's something for everybody at JimCornette.com, including the $9 Classic Wrestling DVD sale. And I've beaten the piss out of talking about the Wrestling Gold set because it sells so well, and people all over the world have fallen in love with it. But I've neglected to mention until somebody brought it up, the Straight Shooting series that we talked about last year. I reintroduced to the world last year. My interviews with wrestling legends ranging from Bobby Heenan, 3 volumes, to Bill Watts, 2 volumes, to 1 each on J.J. Dillon, Percy Pringle, and Bruno Sammartino, which was a mark-out moment for me about his entire career. They're each DVD between 2 and 3 hours in length, and they're only $9 each also. But if you get all 8, you can get all 8 for $50 for the set, which is like $6 and change per DVD autographed. It's insane, and people weren't aware of that because we kind of sloughed off on it because it was so big last year, and then I just assumed that everybody had one. But apparently they're moving now at this new sale price. And of course, the $10 Cult of Cornette membership certificate with a variety of autographed 8x10s along with it, the new Outlaw Mud Show T-shirt, which is taking the nation and Outlaw Mud Shows by storm, and the action figures, books, burger towels, and more, stocking stuffers, gifts for the fan in your life, or the fan that you'd like to have in your life. I understand. As a matter of fact, I will send a special free gift to the first person that provides documentation that they were able to give a member of the opposite sex one of my articles from JimCornette.com and got some off of it.
But what if it's someone from the same sex? It should count also.
Oh, well, okay. Yeah, as long as you can provide documentation that you gave it to a person that you wanted to have some type of sexual congress with and they responded in kind, then I'll send you a free gift.
If you get laid because of Cornette, get in touch with the show.
But yeah, there you go, and just send some pictures. And
I didn't say that.
No, some kind of documentation. I can't just be sending free gifts out to everybody.
Well, that's true.
Fuck, everybody would say, "Oh yeah, I got some." No, I need to see some type of fucking video.
We can't solicit pornography through the mail. We can't tell people to be sending photos of this to us, to you.
I guess I didn't think that all the way through. I was just trying to come up with another promotion to give the fans more of their money's worth and more than they bargained for when they do business with me. I was trying to give out free stuff, and now you've tainted it for me. I'm taking the whole thing back.
It's the winter Polaroid promotion.
I'm taking the whole thing back. You've spoiled it for me. You've made it.
No, please,
bad now.
Please give it a try, please.
No, they can still send the pictures of the videos, but I'm not sending anything free out.
Okay.
All right. Anyway, but if you don't want to send stuff like that through the mail, you got 2 chances the rest of this year to see me in person at the Louisville SuperCon. We're big time now. Louisville's getting a SuperCon. Down at the International Convention Center, downtown Louisville, November 28th through December 2nd. Jerry the King Lawler will be there also, and maybe I can give him this Lego thing I've had in my house for 3 months. But I'll be there with a full line of merchandise, also some cool comic books, some high-grade Silver Age stuff, and also contact me by email if you'd like me to bring special comic books, because if you want it, chances are I may have it. And then, of course, the Nashville Comic Con at the fairgrounds in Nashville, right next to the wrestling arena, on December 8th and 9th, the Midnight Express 35th anniversary. Bobby Eaton will be there, and Dennis Condrey, the first appearance he's made since he kicked cancer's ass, and we will be doing photo ops and signing autographs and doing all kinds of stuff both days. And everybody in Middle Tennessee or wherever, if you can, Central Kentucky, come on down and see Dennis. Dennis was in Nashville as a heel one night. I think he's working for Nick Goulas, and he comes out the back of the fairgrounds, and he can't find his car. He's got a bright red Corvette, right? And he's trying to get out, but I guess if the last match was on, he's trying to, beat the crowd or whatever. And he's looking around everywhere, and finally he realizes his car was there. It's just the fans had gone out while the matches were going on. He had so much heat, and they painted it black, windows and all. It was just happened. But when you take a bunch of black paint and turn it over the goddamn red Corvette, little red Corvette becomes a black bullet. That's how much heat Dennis Condrey got with people, I'll tell you that. He always had nice cars, though. Anyway, so come on out to Nashville on December 8th and 9th and see us. Go to JimCornette.com and click on events and appearances, because we have a few more of the 2019 dates for the Midnight 35th Anniversary Tour. And we got big news real quick, and I'm running through this quickly as I can, folks. But we got so much going on. I'm not even going to go into the behind the curtain update this week because I don't want to be so commercial. But the art is being micromanaged. I mean, it's going to be accurate. But anyway, we have an update on the long-awaited YouTube business. We're starting again, folks. They've made up with us a little bit, so we're going to give them one more try. The official Jim Cornette YouTube channel will debut. When does everybody get on the internet? Black Friday, next week, November 23rd, the day after Thanksgiving, while you're sitting there trying to figure out what the fuck to do. Go to our YouTube channel and because you got to watch a certain amount of our minutes, which is minuscule in the overall scheme of things. And we got to get, a couple thousand people to sign up, which I think we did that last time in about a day and a half. And then we can start running our ads and expanding the channel and bringing it all to fruition like we were trying to do before. Is that correct?
That is correct. And we plan to initially launch with several recent full episodes up. So check that out. And we will have the actual address and what you should look for in the coming days on Twitter and, of course, on...
Well, no, wait a minute. We don't have the name of the thing or the...
Well, no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying we're not putting up all the information just yet. We're still getting a couple of the things, some of the kinks worked out. But stay tuned to Twitter. We don't want to tell
anybody anything wrong. But there's a name of the channel. There's a name of our channel now, correct?
It's the official Jim Cornette channel.
Official yes. Jim Cornette. Well, you'd have to be a goddamn blithering simpleton not to be able to find that now, wouldn't you?
There are a few of them out there, from what I understand.
Anyway, that's it's going to be Friday, Black Friday, November 23rd, and we will update you this week on the drive-through, which we're never going to miss again, and then next week on our holiday Thanksgiving Turkey Day edition of the experience.
Hey, Jim, I have to ask you, you brought up earlier, and you've always brought up whenever you do these appearances, your comic book collection. Stan Lee passed away this past week. You actually, got into an edition of Rawhide Kid. So what are you thinking when you hear about Stan Lee? I mean, it's amazing.
I also have a card, which I have no reason to believe, a postcard from Stan and the Gang, which it's signed Stan and the Gang. So since I've had it since 1972, I'm going to say that it was Stan Lee that signed it, Stan and the Gang. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. But no, I've said this before, but I guess it's because of my nature. I always liked the Marvel comics better, even though I've got into everything just because I wanted to read everything and blah, blah, blah. But the Marvel comics were more realistic and just cooler to me because it had a little more element of the DC stuff was really WWF-y. It was kind of more cartoony and fantasy until they got, edgy in the 70s or whatever. But the early Marvel stuff, one of the first comic books that I read was Journey into Mystery 83, the fucking Thor origin, that I was in a box along with Avengers 4 and Avengers 1 that was in a box that I got from my cousin. And that was all. But Stan Lee he was around for the pioneer days, the golden age of comics, because he was 96, right? He and Kirby popped the superhero thing for, timely back in the golden age before, any of us were born. And so he had 2 or 3 different revolutionary eras in comics.
I believe I could be wrong, but I believe in the actual Marvel Comics #1, he wrote the Submariner comic.
Yes.
Which was the debut of Submariner, the first superhero for Marvel.
And who was, wait a minute, Everett was the artist for Submariner originally, correct?
I think so.
Bill Everett. Yeah. Yes. But so anyway, so he was doing that. And when I was a kid, at one point, I didn't believe it was the same guy, because I'm like, how can this guy be? But I didn't know that he was very young then in 1939, and he was, somewhat getting old by the 70s. But anyway, so but I mean, he was 96 once again. It wasn't unexpected. It's sad, but I don't think anybody can make the case he was taken from us in the prime of his life. So when you could live to be almost 100 years old and do all that shit, you've done good. He did good. He done good.
Created some successful gimmicks that lasted throughout time.
And were stolen by various wrestling territories across the country. The
Hulk? Yeah, that's right.
Speaking of stealing things from successful programs, you do a variety of shows every week that you take things from and make them your own. What are you doing this week?
I steal from myself and apply it to myself. We have several things going on. I want to mention the latest Super Studcast. Ron Fuller talks with Cowboy Bill Watts. You can hear that at patreon.com/studcast. I also want to make mention that John McAdam and Sean Goodwin on Stick to Wrestling are reviewing classic 1970s Madison Square Garden shows. Check that out at McAdamPod.com or wherever it is that you find your favorite podcasts. And of course, the 605 Super Podcast, The Mothership. We got a few things to say about the Mothership this week. Episode 93, the long-awaited episode 93. I think I finally decided.
How long have I been waiting for that? I've been waiting for that episode 93 for years now.
Years. Well, I have finally decided what segments to use for this episode. Stay tuned. It should be coming up in the next couple of days. We're going to have Peter Burkholz and Ron Fuller both on discussing Jose Lothario. We're also going to have independent manager Al Getz on, talk about a brand new statistic he has developed to apply to classic wrestling research, which is very interesting. It's something I'm very much fascinated with. Also, we're going to talk Jackson, Mississippi with Jeff Steele, more Pandemonium Theater, and so much more. The 605 Super Podcast. And don't forget the anniversary show next week with the co-host, Jim Cornette. Say hello, Jim.
Yeah. I'm doing that again, ain't I?
At 605pod.com or available wherever it is that you find your favorite podcast, The Mothership.
Oh, God damn it, you snuck it in on me. All right. Before we get to the wrestling talk, I'm going to blow through some current events here real quickly because I just jotted some things down that I had to comment on. So don't whine, everybody. But there's been so much happen in the last week. It's every day. President Puke Possums in France throwing a fucking temper tantrum because they got kind of their ass kicked in the election and things didn't go his way, so he didn't want to go out in the rain at the cemetery. Blah, blah, blah. And it goes on. And the election recounts that we're still going through. And I know all of our listeners in the UK and Australia and everywhere are going, these dumb fucking bastards just can't get their shit together. But here, real quick, here's a statistic for you. Remember when about a year ago, the Republicans and Trump cut the taxes for all the big businesses? And the idea was now they'll bring all of this money that they've got overseas in other countries. They'll bring it all back since they can save all that tax money they'd had to pay on it. And then, of course, they'll hire a bunch more people and all the workers' wages will go up and the economy will boom because we cut all the taxes for the big corporations. According to J.P. Morgan Chase, which is a big corporation, $270 billion was repatriated, was brought back to the United States by these big companies as a result of these tax cuts. Brian, did you know that? $270 billion?
Actually, I did.
Well, you're not the smartest motherfucker in the world. Anyway, of that, guess what almost half of it, $124 billion, went to?
Stock buybacks.
Stock buybacks. What the Democrats and what the independent financial and economical experts said was going to happen that these companies were going to do, they did. They spent a half of that $270 billion on themselves. They bought their own stock back. The 1,000 largest companies over the last year have cut 140,000 jobs, and this tax cut for these businesses added $779 billion to the U.S. deficit in just 2018. So it's nice to know that in addition to being a golden shower expert, that blithering fucking disgusting pig is also a goddamn economist. He's an expert. Yes, and our elections are still going on, but at least it's getting closer to the good side of things. Florida is completely fucked up. Both the Senate race with DeSantis and Nelson and the governor's race with Gillum and Uncle Creepy Rick Scott. Wait a minute. I got that backwards. Gillum is in the governor's race with DeSantis. The former governor, Uncle Creepy Rick Scott, is in the fucking Senate race with Nelson. Both Republicans were declared the winners on election night, but, and this is where this fucking Rick Scott idiot, they figured out that, wait a minute, all these ballots aren't in yet, and all these mail-in ballots and these absentee ballots haven't actually been processed. And service people overseas, they mail in however many, a few thousand or whatever. But the point is, these elections were so close. When they got 8 million votes cast in a state and the difference was like less than 25,000 or whatever the fuck, it was so close that they figured out mathematically this still might be open. And they started counting everything, and now they're recounting everything. But in Florida, which should have learned from Bush v. Gore in 2000, Dade County, Miami, their election process is fucked up. They got some simpleton running it, and she's a Democrat, but she's apparently still a simpleton. And now Rick Scott is basically saying, no, just declare us the winners and just, don't worry about this recount, because we know that these election officials are fucked up down there. He was the governor of the state for the past 8 years, and he didn't fix any of this shit, and he knew that it was fucked up, and now that it's benefiting him, he wants them to close it down, but they're trying to recount the ballots, but their goddamn machines broke down. So we still don't exactly know for sure. It appears that Gillum probably will still lose, but DeSantis and Nelson is closer than that. And so Scott and Nelson. Let me try this again. God damn it. And also I think the dog catcher race in Florida is also still open. In Georgia, Stacey Abrams is suing to make sure all the ballots are counted. Kemp is having a fucking heart attack. And in Arizona, Kirsten Sinema beat the Republican Martha McSally, right? Or Marsha McSally or whatever, confusingly Brady Bunch named Republican bitch out there. But they had called it for the Republican that night, but it was only like 5,000 votes difference. Now the Democrat has actually won the thing when they finished counting everything. They never apparently count everything. But all this shit was so close, they have to count everything, and now they're filing lawsuits over it. It's ludicrous. And all the Republicans could do, including the governor, Kemp versus Abrams. Kemp was the Secretary of State that was overseeing the election that he was running in for governor. He was in charge of that, and he still barely beat this woman so far, and maybe not in the end. And, suppressed all the black votes and all the absentee ballots they tried to kick out. And Rick Scott, who was the governor of the whole state for 8 years and fucked everything up down there, he was in charge of all the election officials and everything else, but he didn't fix anything, and they fucked it up again. But this time it might come back to bite him in the ass. And as we said, dipshit canceled his Veterans Day appearance at the Service Memorial over in France because it was raining. But he's mad because he had to wait till after the election to fire Jeff Sessions. You can tell he didn't want, because he did it like 12 hours later. But he appointed, ladies and gentlemen, in other countries, the president of the United States, who is being investigated by a special prosecutor for collusion with an enemy foreign power, Russia, and whether he did it or whether just a bunch of people in his fucking campaign and in his administration did it remains to be seen. But this special investigator has gotten, what was it at last count, 30-something indictments and 100 either guilty pleas or convictions for these charges?
Something.
A lot. So Trump fires the attorney general, who is effectively the top cop in the United States and is the guy who normally would oversee an investigation like this. But Jeff Sessions had recused himself. He recused himself, Kingfish, from the equation because he had worked and been involved with Trump's campaign. So that meant that the acting assistant attorney general was in charge, but that guy got fired. So once he fired Sessions, basically Trump has appointed somebody that nobody's ever heard of, that wasn't in the attorney general's office at all, that just happens to have gone on record in the past as saying that there was absolutely no evidence of any collusion and Trump's writing everything and you can't subpoena the president and all this stuff. He has appointed this guy, the attorney general, to oversee the investigation into himself. Did I pretty much sum that up, Brian?
Pretty much, yeah.
And this new attorney general, Whitaker, was involved in a scam company that basically stole the life savings from a bunch of old folks, including retired veterans, by telling them that if they were inventors, they could get them patents and make them millions of dollars. And the Federal Trade Commission, which is also something that Trump and his people try to abolish, fined this company $26 million. They were paying this Whitaker character as a paid consultant because of his legal background and his credibility, so that they could bilk these fucking people out of their money. This is the new attorney general appointed by President Puss Pocket. And one more thing.
Acting attorney general.
Acting attorney general. Well, he'll be acting that way for a while, I would imagine, and at least until the Democrats get a hold of him and figure out what else he's done. But one more thing before we get off of the current events. You know, the argument, more people obviously got shot this week. It's America after all. So I could say that without fear of contradiction. But I think it's been almost 5 or 6 days since our last mass shooting, at least one I've seen on the news. They have them pretty much daily that just don't go reported. But in this one, this specific gun incident, you know how they always say, boy, if that guy went off in the bar, went off in the concert, went off the theater, went off wherever, if there was just more good guys with guns, right? Lives would be saved. Good things would happen. So I think it was Minnesota. A fucking guy gets kicked out of a bar, drunk, gets a gun, comes back in, starts shooting people, right? Shoots at people, shoots a couple people. The security guard at the bar fucking takes this guy down on the ground, fucking holds him, has a gun in his back, right? You ain't moving, motherfucker. The cops are coming. The cops get there. The good guys with the guns are, and there's a good guy with the gun sitting on top of the bad guy who had the gun before, and the cops shoot the security guard.
No, come on.
Graveyard dead. He was black, by the way. I forgot, or elsewise it would have given away the ending of the story. The security guard's black. He's got the fucking guy that shot these people down on the ground. He's got him neutralized. He's got the gun in his back. He's holding for the cops. The cops come in, shoot the fucking, while the people are screaming, no, he's ours. He's ours. Bam, bam, bam. He's dead.
The whole argument the NRA has is that the only thing that can stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. Unless the cops shoot him, too.
But it's got to be a white good guy with a gun.
Oh, my God.
Because if the cops see a black guy with a gun, good, bad, or indifferent, that guy's getting shot. And also the statistic was released, or might have escaped. Guess how many people, let me narrow this down. Guess how many black men were shot and killed by police officers last year?
I have no idea.
Somewhere around 3,000. I believe it was 30 and change. I can't remember the exact number.
Wow. I did not think it would be that high. Wow.
Well, see, there you go. Thinking again. I'll do the thinning around here, Baba Louie. Anyway, so yeah, the good guy with the gun works every time.
Has anyone brought that up to the NRA yet? I'd love to hear their response.
Well, of course, it's been all over Twitter. It was all over the news. It was in the goddamn, there's clipping of video news pieces that have been shared around.
What have they said? What has the NRA said?
I haven't heard from Dana and her husband, fucking Crispy Whiplosh. I don't know what they have to say for themselves.
All right.
Probably that. Well, have we checked that fucking security guard's background? Because I bet he did something sometime. That's probably their. Just check around. Anyway, I got some cool stuff from the listeners that we need to talk about related to wrestling, and just tell a few stories just to lighten the mood up a little bit, because it's been such a stressful week. And you and me being successful media moguls, we hardly could find time to record this fucking program.
It is hard
here this week. There was certain things that came up, being as that we're, as I said, both successful and in demand, and and then there was the diapers and everything. No, anyway,
well, it's true.
Yeah, well, Harley had to wear Dale Spear, my friend Dale. We love you, Dale. Formerly of the radio in Charlotte, North Carolina, and now not. More on that at another date. But he heard the show that we did on the biggest box office attractions, which was just last week, right? I believe it was.
Yeah, that was last week's show.
We read down the list of the biggest box office attractions in wrestling, and he sent a flyer. And I wish it was the original, but I've just printed it out. But we've talked before about promoter Fred Kohler in Chicago and the Dumont Network Chicago National Wrestling Television show of the early 50s, and that what made such big stars. Fred Kohler was doing things he was ahead of his time. He was doing a lot of Vince-like things back in the early 50s. And one of them was, not only did he have that television contract where he was making money for the TV show, but he had a crew of guys signed up under contract. And because of that national TV, they were stars all over the place. So he booked the big stars out and took, in a lot of cases, a cut of either the guy's pay or a cut of the houses from the promoter, maybe both, who knows. That's why that Verne Gagne, as we've talked about, one of the reasons alleged why Verne Gagne never got the NWA world title was because when Thez was the NWA champion, and he would appear on certain television from time to time. He even worked in Chicago. He would be on the Hollywood, California TV from time to time. But since he traveled all over the world and the NWA didn't have its own dedicated TV, he was not on a ton. It was still by, reputation, word of mouth, newspaper, etc. in those days. With Thez's, and he still drew big. Obviously, he was the world champion. But Fred Kohler created the United States Championship. And that was his title that was defended on that television. Well, not, every once in a while they might show a title defense, but that champion was featured on the Dumont television, then was booked out. And he did the same thing that Sam Muchnick and the NWA did with Thez. The champion got 10% of the gate, and then they kicked back, 2% or whatever to the booking office. But that's one of the reasons it's been cited for why Gagne got over for those hot few years there, even stronger than the NWA title as United States champion, because of that TV. So there was some lingering mistrust, apparently. And that's why when Gagne took all that money that he was making and went home and bought into Minnesota, he just said, fuck it, I'll take care of this. I'll establish my own championship. And he was the first guy to do that, to buy a territory and make his own title on a major league basis. But anyway, having said that, I said all those things to illustrate that Fred Kohler kept records. And in those days, when you reported on wrestling, you tried to make it not only just as grand and as big as you could, but also realistic, like boxing. So, and you've seen them because you've got some in your collection and those old Wayline magazines. But Kohler had a booking office, the International Wrestling Agency, the IWA, 817 Gray Street, Chicago 13, Illinois. Phone Wellington 52218. And he would put out flyers on, hey, contact us if you want a wrestling show, or he would even send flyers advertising individual talents and whether they were big drawing cards and whether they were important and you should go see them. And we've talked about in the early 50s, the five highest paid professional athletes in the United States were the world heavyweight boxing champion and 4 pro wrestlers, because there was no money at that point in the National Football League. There wasn't really any money yet in baseball. Even, I mean, the 1919 White Sox or Black Sox were making like $3,000 a fucking year, right? And it didn't change a ton. That's why Wahoo and Ernie Ladd, all those guys left football. Maybe there was starting to be some money in basketball. I don't even know about that, but in a lot of cases, probably not. So Gagne, for a couple of years there, was probably, one of the top 5 guys, but I've always heard that the biggest heel they had during that period was Hans Schmidt, right? And when you think about 1951, 52, 53, that's 6, 7, 8 years after World War II, and here comes a fucking German. And he didn't have the swastikas. They didn't use those till the 60s. There was a little grace period there. And then the von Brauners came along and et cetera. But Hans Schmidt, even before Fritz von Erich, he was portrayed as pretty much, they didn't say, I don't think he was a Nazi, but he was a German. He looked the part, huge, overbearing, had an accent, blah, blah, blah. And this guy got to be the biggest heel in the wrestling business. And he was another one of the guys that were one of those 4 or 5 highest paid athletes in the country. And this flyer is the classic picture of him with the big hand up. And it says Hans Schmidt, the biggest drawing card in wrestling. But it gives records for some of the towns that he was in. And I thought just a couple of these, for example, he apparently, and once again, Kohler kept the records. And this kind of, as we'll talk about here in a second, breaks down to where it sounds true. He wrestled 7 times in Chicago, Illinois between October 52 and August 53. And the total gross houses were $156,000. So when you divide 156,000, as my calculator might try to do, divided by 7, he's doing houses of $22,000 in Chicago on average every time, which doesn't sound like a lot today until you realize that tickets back in those days, and you've got some of those magazines, we're looking at general admission in some of these places $1 and $2, and even in a big city like Chicago, $3 ringside. So now that suddenly becomes more like an average of 8,000 or 9,000 people to all those shows, right? In Milwaukee, which was a hot town back then, especially because of the Chicago, wrestling was so big in Chicago at the time, and Milwaukee up the road, even before Crusher, 6 shows did $100,000, which is an average of 16 and change per show, which once again, with $2 and $3 tickets, you're looking at 5,000-6,000 people. But I mean, all of this, Syracuse, New York, 9 matches grossed $80,000. St. Louis, 5 matches grossed $60,000. Omaha, which was another major wrestling town, especially in those days, 7 shows drew $62,000. Toledo, 8 shows drew $63,000. And anyway, Kansas City, one time he drew $11,000, which was probably 5,000-ish people. And then one date in Toronto, $14,000. But I mean, anyway, the total that's listed here is 71 matches for $701,000, and then other matches, dates are probably the smaller towns, 82 matches for $526,000. So their claim is that he wrestled in 10 months, which is believable, 153 times, and his matches grossed $1.2 million. In today's money...
And that's 52, you said?
That's between October 52 and August 1953. And, once again, we see the newspaper ads with the ticket prices. So we know kind of what they were for these various shows. And I mean, it also lists Albany, Schenectady, New York, and Galesburg, Illinois, and some of these Peoria, some of these other. In Peoria, he was there 8 times, drew 25 grand. That's like drawing 1,000 people in Peoria 8 times in the same year. What the fuck? And Peoria wasn't as big then as it is now, by God. But anyway, this is, you think if he's going around as one of the big cards off of the network TV, then he's probably getting a piece of the house, or at least a very good payoff. And they're pushing him, so he's got to be, besides the champion, Fred Kohler's top 2 or 3 guys. So he was easily, I would think, making $100 grand a year, because we've seen reports of what some of those guys would make. I don't think that's out of the way. And in 1952, hold on, and I'll type it in right now, if it works. $100,000 is worth $954,283 today. And if you go back and you say, okay, he drew 1.2 million over those 10 months at the gate, that's equivalent today to $11.5 million in 10 months, including 8 times in Peoria. So wrestling was huge, and I thank Dale for that, because it also says all-time house records in Springfield, Moline, Illinois, Sioux City, Iowa, Lincoln, Nebraska, Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, Sioux Falls, South Dakota, Gary, Indiana, Saratoga, New York, and many others for booking, wire, write, or phone. And I mean, and a lot of this stuff also went through athletic commissions, so they were doing some business in those days. And that was Fred Kohler on national television and sending his talent out to top cards for other promoters all across the country, kind of doing a Vince thing before Vince did a Vince thing. But poor Verne never got the belt for it. I got an email. Would you like to hear an email?
Yeah.
Jim emailed and said, I watched the Midnight Express versus JYD and Hacksaw Duggan match from Mid-South Television, August 2, 1984. I noticed your powder throw on JYD came up a little short, so he crawled through the powder on the mat and dragged his face through it. Now that's a pro. So it reminded me of this story. It is fucking that we get to TV one time and see that we're on the format. We're going to work with the Midnight Express versus JYD and Hacksaw Duggan, who were the top 2 singles baby faces in the territory. And usually JYD was programmed with Butch Reed, and Duggan had been programmed with, the Russians and whatever. But Watts wanted main event matches on TV, and he wanted to mix it up a little bit. And also, this was headed towards the aborted match that we had with JYD at the Superdome. It was supposed to be JYD, but he left between the time that this was taped and the time that the Superdome came up later on in August, and so it ended up being Sonny King, which is Sonny King and Dusty Rhodes instead of JYD and Dusty Rhodes. I was a tad let down.
So were the fans.
Well, there you go. But anyway, in this match, because we didn't usually work with, we'd worked with Duggan a number of times, and we'd only worked with JYD a few times, and so it was a feeling out process, because you didn't really go over shit then beforehand. So it wasn't like the most artistic or fluid Midnight Express match, right? But it was okay, and people see it and have liked it since then. But at one point, I remember some way going into the finish, Duggan, I think, was going to give Bobby an ass bump, and he'd fly backwards and then hit the referee, and the referee had to go down for me to throw the powder, right? Well, I saw Bobby. Duggan is nailing him, and Bobby's staggering around the ring, and I thought, for the first time ever, I don't know if I've ever seen this, Bobby Eaton is lost. I can tell Bobby's lost. I've never seen this before, right? And Bobby staggers over to the ropes near me, and he goes, Corny, I'm lost. I said, ass bump, right? Ass. Oh, okay. It was the atomic drop. We called it the ass bump. So Bobby swings at Duggan, and Duggan ducks and picks him up, gives him the ass bump, and they bump the referee. So meanwhile, JYD has given Dennis the thump, the power slam. Over on the other side of the ring, I'm supposed to jump up on the apron, and when Dog comes to me, I'm supposed to throw the powder in his face and blind him. Well, where he thumped Dennis, it was on the other side of the ring because here's Duggan and Bobby on this side and the referee's laying there. So I go around the other side. No problem. I can readjust my positioning, except this was the middle of the summer in the Irish McNeil Boys Club and there was no air conditioning. And so they had brought in these giant fans. I'm not talking about the ones that bought tickets. I'm talking about the ones that blow. 6 foot tall fans in this building at the fairgrounds with no air conditioning in the middle of a Louisiana summer. So it's moving some air, right? And it's keeping people from passing out of heat frustration. But those big giant fans are on the backside of JYD. As I jump up, JYD jumps up and comes to me and I see nothing but and I feel the air. And I'm like, oh, motherfucker. It's like standing behind one of those jet engines, just blowing that shit. And I got that whole handful, and I waited till he got right as close to me as I could, and I threw that shit as hard as I could, and half of it blew back on me, and the rest of it, the plastic bag that I had it in dropped down to the mat, and there was some of it still left in there, and it kind of spread all over the mat, but most of it just blew right back behind me, right? And Dog sells his eyes and quickly drops down for that baggie. Now, it could have been quick thinking on his part. He might have thought I'd lost a baggie of something else. I'm not sure at that point in Dog's career. But he does. He goes face first down and rubs his face in the powder. So because he's black, powder's white, so people could see if he didn't have any powder on him, right? And he looks up and he's got powder on him. I'm like, oh, thank fucking God. It was just a disaster all the way around. That was not one of my favorite matches that we ever had. But I thank you, Jim, for bringing it back to my attention 34 years after I thought I'd forgotten about it and lived it down forever. I got another email. I've never gotten an email from anyone who, well, at least that had brought to my attention that they worked for the Greyhound bus lines. But this person did. Craig, as a matter of fact, says he wanted to thank us for thank me, actually, not you, because you haven't had many years of work within the wrestling industry. Always pleased when your podcasts come out and have never been disappointed. I have worked for Greyhound for 32 years in Western Canada. But on October 31st, 2018, and this is a few weeks before that, I'm behind, they will be closing the doors and shutting down operations in this division. Unfortunately, there is nothing to transfer to, so many of us will be looking for work. Would you by any chance have any stories about Greyhound during your travels? Did you ever have to use the bus to get someone out of your area? Once again, many thanks for your continued work, Craig. And Craig, our sympathies on your discontinued work. But it got me to thinking, once again, Bobby Eaton is in this story. It's the Bobby Eaton hour. When Bobby first got into business, right? Well, he started wrestling. I don't know if he had a driver's license the first match he had, because I think he was still 15. But when Nick Goulas actually started using him regularly, he was, I think, a little bit before his 18th birthday that he was, making most all the towns. So he told me at one point he had bought this old used car and was making payments on it. And it broke down. He didn't have the money to get it fixed because did I mention he's working for Nick Goulas? So he gets another car and he's arranged with this guy to make some payments on that. So he's got something to drive around and that one breaks down. He swore to me at one point, he was working for Nick Goulas. He was making payments on 2 cars that wouldn't run and taking the Greyhound bus to fucking Huntsville and Birmingham and Chattanooga to make the towns for Nick. Which was, you got to picture Bobby on the bus anyway. He probably made a lot of friends, but yeah, and that's why I think after that, whenever he finally got a decent job in the wrestling business, he always had the USS Alabama, a giant Lincoln Continental of some description. He had to pay 3 parking meters for. But we talked about this on the show a week or two ago. I've never ridden a bus, but we rode a train. Because you live up in the Northeast and public transportation is a big thing up there. People ride trains and buses and subways and all that stuff. I'm from down here in Kentucky. As I mentioned, where I grew up here, for fuck's sake, I would have needed a car to get me to the nearest place that I could get on a bus, right? So it's not the same thing. But when we started going up to the Northeast more regularly, we got Philly down and Baltimore down because, we had Baltimore was easy, and Philly we had guys like Frank Chili and Dennis Corluzzo that be picking us up and carrying us around. But then they started in 88 or 89, WCW expands, and they start going farther north. So they booked us one night in Philly and the next night in New Haven, Connecticut. And we've never been to New Haven, Connecticut before. And I'm looking at the road atlas, and I see that it goes straight through New York to get from one to the other. And I'm like, fuck, Jesus Christ, guys, this is going to be a hell trip. And we talk to everybody and say, oh, if you drive, it's only 180 or 200 miles, but it could take you 6, 7, 8 hours. You never know what's going to go on, right? So, but somebody came in and said, we should all take the train. What? Yeah, they got, I don't know if it was Amtrak or whatever trains they had up there in the 80s. Have you ever taken a train up there?
Yeah, often. I used to take the Long Island Railroad on a daily commute, and I've taken Amtrak out of Penn Station. I'm sure it was Amtrak.
All right, well, there you go. Then it might even been if Penn Station's in Pennsylvania, if where we were in Philly, wherever the fuck it was. Well, anyway, see, that's another thing. It's very confusing up there. But anyway, so these fucking numbnuts, I can't remember who it was, but they talk a bunch of us boys into taking a train. All right. So we get there to the train station. We've got a rental car, right? But we got to come back to Philly. No. I take that back. We took a cab to the train station because we dropped off our rental car. We take a train to the cab station, cab to the train station. Now we've got all our bags and shit, right? We get on this fucking train and it's empty, and there's a place to put your bags and everything. I thought, oh, well, this is great. We'll just avoid all this traffic and look out the windows, but we're fucking dead tired. So once the train takes off and we've looked out the window for a few minutes, while I'm reading my magazine, I start kind of zoning off into my own world. Stan Lane's sitting behind me. Bobby's next to me. Stan's sitting behind me in a row all to himself. He likes it that way. He goes to sleep. Train stops. More people get on. Going on, it gets a little more crowded. Next time train stops again, a bunch more people get on. It does get a little more crowded. I'm looking back. Stan has not woke up yet. I don't know what he did the night before, but I can only imagine in my dreams. By the time that train had stopped about 3 or 4 times, I'm looking around because now me and Bobby are, thank God we're next to each other, because there is every variety of person you've ever seen in your life. Every seat is full. There's people sitting cross-legged in the aisleways, standing up, hanging onto the thing. I'm starting to it's a little tight. And plus, some of these people, you can tell, maybe have not bathed or showered or washed their clothes in the recent millennia. And I know how Stan is, right? And finally, something happens. The ding ding comes on, and he wakes up, and he looks around, and I hear him when he wakes up. He's like, "Oh!" Because there's people all over the top of me. He went to sleep in an empty train car, and he woke up. There's somebody next to him. There's somebody's ass in his face that fucking stinks. Because he told us later on that was the source of the stinking, was the ass in his face. So we get to, and it starts getting hot in there, and we finally get to New Haven and get off. Now we've got our bags. And we're going to get a cab, right? And we go to the cab and we say, well, we need to go to New Haven Coliseum. He said, well, that's the next block over. He won't take us, or 2 blocks over, or whatever. It's short enough. So now we're walking, sweating balls, lugging our shit. It's fucking summertime, as I recall. And we're walking down the streets of New Haven. Of course, we take a right where we're supposed to take a left. We have to go around a block. So that tripled the fucking trip to find the fucking building. And then by the time we walk up, there's the goddamn fans outside waiting to get in. So here comes the Midnight Express. Looked like somebody dumped buckets of water over our head, dragging our shit like we got put out on the side of the road by whoever we hitched a ride with. And as we wandered into the fucking, thank God there wasn't many fans. And I think that's the last time they ran New Haven. But anyway, thank you, Craig, and sorry about your luck with Greyhound for reminding me of that. Here's one that you might be able to help me out with, because I don't know if you studied your AWA history, your early 70s stuff.
A little bit, not recently.
Well, there was a camp in the early 70s that produced several wrestling talents that people have still heard of today. Ric Flair, the Iron Sheik,
Ken Patera,
Patera.
Chris Taylor.
There you go. The forgotten man. Because Mick writes, hoping you can shed some light on a particular wrestler. I went to community college, and this is another thing you can help with. I've never known how to pronounce this fucking town. Dowagiac, Michigan?
I can't help you with that at all.
Chris Taylor's hometown, Dowagiac, Dowagiac, for you Michiganites out there. That was Chris Taylor's hometown, and when he went to the Olympics, it became famous for a few minutes. But he says the childhood city of Chris Taylor, 1972 bronze medalist at the Munich Games. I can't seem to find much about his short run with the AWA in the mid-70s, save for a couple of squashes featuring the likes of Ric Flair and Rene Goulet. Had his health not failed him at such a young age, could he have been the guy for the AWA or a territory like Big Time Wrestling? How big of a push was he getting? What were the plans for him? Well, this would be a good one for Greg Gagne, but I think I can probably give a vague answer. I think once they saw what they kind of had, I don't think there were a lot of plans. But Chris Taylor is a classic. He's a great trivia question answer, because what was the first pro wrestling match aired in the United States on network television after the 1950s boom was gone and the shows were canceled? The first network TV wrestling match after like 1956.
It was Chris Taylor's debut match.
It certainly was.
Yeah.
Against who? Mad Dog Vachon.
Mad Dog Vachon, that's right.
Yes.
That's right.
Because I watched it when it aired on ABC's Wide World of Sports. Chris Taylor went to the Olympics, and Ken Patera went to the same set of Olympics in Munich. But being as Verne Gagne had already heard about him, obviously Patera being from Minnesota anyway, and had already signed them up to early developmental deals, and was going to train them when they got out of the Olympics. And that's why he was hoping that they both won, which unfortunately didn't work out. But because of that, and they were publicized in the wrestling magazines, I actually not only watched the 72 Olympics primarily for Chris Taylor and Ken Patera to cheer them on, but also as soon as the Olympics were, and that was the fucking terrorist Munich Olympics. And so everybody ended up watching it. I was watching it beforehand for those guys. And then everybody in the country ended up watching it when they had a fucking terrorist incident live on worldwide television. But then when he got trained, they debuted Chris Taylor on ABC's Wide World of Sports on a taped match with Mad Dog Vachon. And the reason why they gave him Mad Dog Vachon, I think, is because not only was Mad Dog was in the 48 Olympics and was a real deal, but also he was the old pro heel in the AWA that could get sympathy on this big fucker and got him through a match when he really didn't know what he was doing. And I've got to admit that I got a little smarter watching that match than I did. They tried everything they could. They even, when fucking apparently Mad Dog bladed the bridge. If he didn't blade it, he just bit it. The bridge of Chris Taylor's nose, because Mad Dog did his biting thing, and Taylor was bleeding from the bridge of the nose. It wasn't a blade job on the forehead. And I remember the announcer even saying, was it Jim McKay? I can't even remember who they gave it to, but saying, my God, because he was kind of shitting on wrestling a little bit, but Mad Dog was so convincing. And then they said, wait a minute, we can see the blood pumping. That's really Chris Taylor's blood, folks. That was a quote on Wide World of Sports. So they did everything they could to make, use out of this thing. But the problem was, to me, I say I got a little smarter because all Chris Taylor was to me in pro wrestling was big. Now, if there's any amateur wrestling enthusiasts out there that want to school me on this, my impression, he wasn't like a Kurt Angle. He wasn't like a Brock Lesnar. He was 6'3" and over 420, and had a giant head. And obviously there was something going on glandularly, because he was just a huge fuck. And there was no way that almost anybody could manhandle him. And then there's the famous picture. He finally got to Alexiev in the Olympics, right? And Alexiev gave him the belly to belly, and people lost their shit. But he was just so big, but he was a plodding big, and you could kind of tell a dull big, and he didn't really. Ken Patera ended up being a great wrestler and could take bumps and was then a heel and could do promos and etc. Chris Taylor was just kind of like the big guy that just waved and belly bumped people. And he didn't come across as a shooter at all, really, or as an Olympian at all. He was just fucking massively fucking huge, and you couldn't do anything with him. So he was believable in that respect. But I've got to think, because the Olympics were in 72. They debuted him in 73. He was gone, what, a year and a half?
Pretty quick, yeah.
So I think they finally just, they had to give up. And I think his health was always bad. And what he died at like 30 or 32, he was diabetic. And I guess weight had got out of control or whatever the fuck. But it was huge. He was pushed to the moon, and Verne Gagne was going to push him to the moon. And he was on network TV, and he won a bunch of 2-ring battle royals, because they love those in the AWA. But if you go back and look at if there's anything on YouTube, maybe past that Wide World of Sports thing might be. But Mad Dog Vachon was the star of that fucking show. And even I at 11 years old or 10 years old or whatever could say, well, this guy don't know what the fuck he's doing.
He turned into a good wrestler later on in his career. But when he first debuted, did anyone in WWF ever make the comparison between Chris Taylor and Mark Henry?
You know what? No, they did not. And I don't know why, because it could have easily gone that way had Mark not,
yeah.
And actually what they did with Mark almost made Mark go that way, because his first match was on pay-per-view. I mean, with Lawler, who was serving the Mad Dog Vachon role. Lawler had matches with people that had even less experience and training than Mark had, which was nil hardly at that point. But Lawler can have a match with anybody. It's like a Bret Hart and a Tom McGee thing. But when they debuted him to such fanfare and then pushed him like that and then put him back in school to train, he lost his momentum, and then he got injured. And if they hadn't have turned around and said, okay, let's start from scratch, and sent him to OVW and brought him back along from scratch when he had he had no idea what he was getting into, because he had been a wrestling fan, but he'd never been around the boys, never been in the locker room. And in those days, he wasn't really particularly that smart. I'm not talking about intelligence-wise, and I'm not talking about he still thought wrestling was real, but there was no internet to learn from. So a lot of these guys that even were wrestling fans, if they had not bothered or thought of or known of to subscribe to the newsletters and go to those extra links, they weren't smart to how the business was worked. They just knew that it was. So, Mark comes in and boom, and his mind is blown, and he had some misconceptions and maybe a little attitude at the start. But once that he settled down and got it, he worked harder than anybody. And he was great from then on, but they almost, ruined him with what they tried to do with him at first before he was ready.
Was Bob Bruggers in that camp also?
Yes, he was, as a matter of fact, I believe.
He may be the real forgotten man.
Yeah, and he was in the plane crash 2 years later. Or he probably would have been a pretty big deal, because he was a big former pro football player, good-looking guy, and was already working in the Carolinas with the best talent in the business. So he got fucked. Yeah, all you pilots of private planes, check your fucking gas gauge, assholes. Here's a two-parter from John. My questions are as follows. Was there anyone that you really enjoyed how they sold the racket shot? Anyone that you thought just sold it perfectly and you almost looked forward to hitting them? Conversely, anyone that you knew it was what it was when you hit them and could only do so much, and their selling of it was just terrible. I'll start with that one. Well, no, and it wasn't. And I loved the guy, but Yokozuna, because, and neither nor he should have flown for it. But when you hit, we were stretching credibility with the loaded racket, right? With the people I'll tell you about here in a second. You'd hit Riggy Morton, he'd get juice, he'd fly around the ring, he'd not take 3 bumps, whatever. That was great. When I hit Yokozuna, he's a 700-something pound man. And, he couldn't really register it that much. He shouldn't take a bump for it. So but it'd been a lot of rackets. But the guy I always used to like to hit was Animal of the Road Warriors, because he was, and we've talked before on how people say the Road Warriors wouldn't sell. They'd sell for you if you sold for them and if you gave them a reason to sell because it was cheating or whatever. But he had such a big, broad back, and it was perfectly shaped so that I got the maximum whack, right? And it sounded like a rifle shot was going off. And when that big fucker took a bump, it looked pretty good. So I loved to hit Animal with it. And Hawk was good too. But Animal just had the shape of the back. You know, it all depends on the contours of your back.
You mentioned how hard it is to get them to sell. There's a video that the WWE just put on the network. It's the entire card from Buzz Sawyer versus Tommy Rich in a cage. And I think it's the Road Warriors versus Jimmy Valiant and Pez Whatley, I think.
God.
It's definitely Jimmy Valiant, who's as ridiculous as Jimmy Valiant as ever, and they're bumping all over the ring for him. It's insane to see that, considering they don't sell for anyone. They didn't do that for Dick the Bruiser a year later.
Well, but
Jimmy Valiant, they're bouncing all over the place.
But see, the thing is, there was a year later. See, timing is everything, my son. They had just gotten to business and weren't really over yet. They just started the push at that time, and they were doing wrestling matches like they'd seen other people do it. Oh, you fall down for me. But quick, when they realized, and probably when Ellering got in their ear a little bit, when they realized that they were being pushed to the fucking moon and they were getting over and the crowds were getting louder and louder, that's when they realized, well, now, okay, we're not supposed to fly for every fucking body. We're supposed to be the goddamn Road Warriors, right? Well, then they went too far in the other direction, and they wouldn't sell a cripple crab a crutch, much less anything else, right? And then by the time we got them in like late 85, early 86, they'd started to get a little smarter to the business and realize that it's not that you don't ever do this, it's just who you do it for and how you do it. And then when Bobby and Dennis's teamwork was so good, and when my racket was over because even Dusty was selling it, and when we'd get them 2-on-3 from behind or 3-on-2 from behind, or Big Bubba would be involved, then they'd fucking sell like goddamn they were going to the electric chair. So it's timing is everything. And part two of John, everyone knows your love of fast food and specifically Wendy's. Being a Midwesterner, specifically in the Quad Cities, we have several Culvers. That is my guilty pleasure as far as fast food goes. The burgers are juicy, fries crispy, and custards delicious. Have you ever had the pleasure of trying this? Culver's is the bomb, and they've got a wide variety on their menu. You can dine in or carry out. They have everything from burgers to pot roast, but I love the Wisconsin butter burgers at Culver's. A triple with bacon. Holy shit. And they do have wonderful custards. And there's also a place now, by the way, there's an alert, Seymour, Indiana, and thereabouts, right off the interstate. Freddy's burgers and custard or whatever. That was pea-picking good itself. Okay. Here we go. Earl 2 and Earl 3 have sent an email.
What?
It says, please give a shout out to my dad, Earl Jr. He's not a wrestling fan, but he tells me every day to put Jimmy on the TV. So hello, Earl Jr. And then, of course, his son would be Earl the Third, right? That's the way these things go. And this is our, let's go home with this one because this is a discussion question because you got to help me remember some people, but he says, I know back in the beginnings of pro wrestling, the champion had to be a hooker who could protect himself from a double cross. Which guys in the 80s and 90s had those same legit match-ending, career-ending skills? Also, which guys in the 80s and 90s were the antithesis of this and couldn't beat anyone's grandma in a real fight? Also, did most wrestlers from the Crockett days maintain legal control over their in-ring personas and gimmicks, or have all those rights passed to the WWE? Could the Midnight Express still bill themselves as such if they wrestled today? Blah, blah, blah. And basically, it's one of my favorite pairings growing up, the Midnight and Fantastics. He also says, what your best and most interesting story about the Midnight and Fantastics matches, because the rock and roll had moved on by the time he discovered the NWA. Well, first off, as far as rights, in those days, even if a promoter gave you a gimmick, unless they took out paperwork, which almost never, ever happened, if you started using it, and you used it before you went to the WWF, then you could use it afterwards in prior usage. And that's pretty much been that way in wrestling. I thought that's another thing that has killed the wrestling business when people started not being able to use the same name everywhere and take it around and make a name out of it and become a star under one name, and have to change names every time they change companies, because it's great for the WWF, but it sucks for the fucking talent. And that's the stupidest thing also. And I know they let marketing and merchandising and all that stuff, but I always, when I was in the wrestling business, if I didn't give Chris Candido his name, but if I started a kid like that and gave him his name, I want him to go out and go to other territories and be a big star and get in all the magazines and be a big time deal, and then come back and do me a favor for getting him started by coming back and drawing me some fucking money sometime.
There's a great example. You didn't do it, but you did change his name. Didn't you change the T to a D in his name? Because that's similar to Mike Rotundo couldn't be called Mike Rotundo after he left the WWF. He had to be Mike Rotunda.
Rotunda, which was his name anyway. But, well, actually I did change it, but I didn't know I changed it, because I changed Tammy's name too, because she and Chris both had those fucking New Jersey accents. So I always thought Chris Candido sounded like Candido. So that's the way that I wrote it, and that's what it became. He gave up on that because everybody was doing it. But when I said, what's Tammy's last name? And they said Sitch, I thought they said Fitch. So she became Tammy Fitch.
How perfect is that? That you got a heel manager, I shouldn't say valet, a heel manager whose last name rhymes with bitch.
Yes, exactly. A female one. Yes. But that's why, because then when they first saw the booking sheets and I think some of the newspaper ads or whatever, they said, you've misspelled Tammy's name. I said, what is it? They said Sitch. I said, oh, S? Well, it's Fitch now, fella. But anyway, but yes, everybody was able to keep their names and gimmicks in those days, and they traveled with them from place to place, unless they wanted to change them themselves if they came up with something new. And that's I always thought the way that it should be. But now big business is involved. Big business screws everything up. But the original question, who in the 80s and 90s were still badasses in the ring, and conversely, who couldn't whip cream with an outboard motor? And we know, obviously, you can put in that category, you can put the Shawn Michaelses of the world. But in that time period, a lot of the guys still had some training, but once you go past the noted shooters and a Kurt Angle or somebody like that, a lot of the guys, more of the guys, for whatever reason, in that era had pro athletic backgrounds of some description. Or high level college athletes, and especially football, the Hacksaw Duggans of the world, the Butch Reeds, those guys could beat the fuck out of you in a fight. Whether they could wrestle was a different story. So I guess the thing is, it started to split off, where a lot of the guys that were, still obviously big, tough pro athletes, just, the Road Warriors, for example, they kicked the shit out of you in a fight. But then I also saw Ronnie Garvin stretch Hawk in a locker room in a friendly shoot, just confined to wrestling, because Ronnie Garvin was a hell of a fucking, hooker and shooter as a wrestler. So it depends on what, I guess that's why they started the Ultimate Fighting Championships, didn't they? To see whose style was best. But it depends on who you're talking about. All the usual suspects, especially a lot of guys that were trained in England, a lot of guys that had been trained around Florida, still could wrestle. But there were a lot of guys back then in the business that, I'm not saying all today's guys are a bunch of pansies, but we do have the obvious size issue. And even and now Conor McGregor proves that, yes, it's the size of the fight and the dog, not the other way around. But, a lot of the indie favorites are not exactly that impressive, or what's the word I'm searching for? Not exactly that awe-inspiring or intimidating physically, that you think this guy will imposing, that you think this guy will pick his fucking teeth with me. When we talked about Mad Dog Vachon a minute ago, who was only 5'6", but he was 200 fucking pounds, and he would, he was a shooter, or he'd just bite your fucking head off. But who were the good shooters in the 80s and 90s? Dr. Death, obviously. Steve Williams. He could do everything. He was a badass and had been an All-American, as a wrestler.
I'm trying to think if there's anyone that we wouldn't normally think of, because obviously you go right to someone like Dr. Death, because he had a reputation for so many years. And whenever the conversation came up, for at least 10 years, who's the toughest guy or the strongest guy in wrestling, he was usually at the top of that list. But who was secretly able to stretch someone if they had to, other than Brian Hildebrand, who did it on Nitro when he had to?
I don't know. And Terry Gordy. I guarantee you, Terry Gordy probably was on the losing end of very few, if any, fucking street fights in his day. And I don't know if he knew any wrestling holds that weren't working holds, because he was a pro when he was 14. It's not like he wrestled in school. So I'm trying to think of who would have been a secret shooter. You know what? We mentioned Gagne's camp. I was told this story actually by Ken Patera. He said that Gagne's camp, they would bring in the stars to let the young athletes work out with them, right? And they'd have a lineup, and they'd say, well, pick who you want to work out with. And some of these guys, they didn't know what, but at one point, they had there's the Crusher. He was legitimately one of the strongest men in the world at fucking, when he was young in the 50s, and a bodybuilder, and now he's the old fucking, beer keg fucking rolling fucker. They don't want to fuck with him. And there's a guy like Professor Dale Lewis, because he worked up there quite a bit in the early 70s, who was an NCAA champion and 6'3" or 4" and 250 something pounds, or Mad Dog Vachon that everybody knew. And there'd be the little guy over on the end, kind of balding, about 195 pounds. Let me work out with him. And it'd be Danny Hodge. And then he just fucking, he said he would tell the fucking guys, here's what I'm going to do to you. He'd tell them in advance, I'm going to take you down this way. I'm going to fucking do this and do that. I'm going to put this hold on. And they couldn't stop him. He'd do it. And then he'd let them up and tell them something else. And then he'd do it again. And they couldn't fucking, and they're like, well, fuck, if this is the fucking little guy, right?
Let's say 1998 WWF, right? Someone's there. Someone shows up and you guys want to do it the old school way and put them in the ring and let them see that wrestling's real. Who would you put them in the ring with?
Oh, God. Well, remember we had Shamrock there at that time.
You did, yeah.
But actually, they didn't.
Steve Blackman was there.
Steve Blackman was there, but actually Steve's discipline was more in the martial arts. I don't think he was that hot of a amateur wrestler, but he was an excellent martial artist. That's how I got him that job, and then they never let him show it again. When he called me, he'd been out of the business for a while because he got a virus overseas, and he'd been out of the business for several years and had lost a lot of weight, but he had trained back. He was in tremendous shape. And he calls me, and I said, "You're Steve Blackman from Calgary? Well, what the fuck? Yeah, come down to the fucking, to the studio and get in the warehouse and let's shoot something." And I had him do the nunchucks and do the leaping spin kicks and do his kata and different karate shit. And I fucking took the tape and actually took it to Vince's house. And for a writing day one time, and popped it in his VCR. And I said, "Look, this guy worked in Calgary with the Hearts. He's smart to the business. He hadn't been seen on TV anywhere in this country. Look at the shape he's in. He's a fucking badass, and he can do all this martial arts shit. He's the lethal weapon. Here, Coco do, right?" Well, fuck. The whole idea was that Blackman had no emotion whatsoever. I mean, he would talk about Lance Storm being serious. Steve Blackman was not a black hole of charisma except when you tried to put him on Gilligan's Island. And then he just fucking didn't fit. So I'm finding these fucking athletes, and the other guy's finding people, he can dress up in fucking women's clothing and paint different colors. It just didn't work. But Blackman, they could have really made him the badass and put him with a manager and blah, 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 or whatever fuck, and it'd have been great. But nevertheless, he was a badass, but he wasn't a great amateur wrestler. And some of the guys that trained in the old days and still had a link to down south could wrestle a little bit better than some of the independent guys that were breaking in the Northeast, because like a guy like Donnie Bass used to get guys in his barn and say, "Okay, well, here's the double wrist lock and the Kimura," right? But is a double wrist lock because that's what it always was. And he'd fucking those guys were deceptive. They could just grab you real quick, a Gene Anderson, and make you wish you'd never been born.
There are a lot of guys that were exposed, like ECW did a great job of trying to build up Taz as if he was some real shooter. And I got to give, them credit for that. I'm not saying that in a bad way. That's how wrestling works. You're supposed to take a guy who can't really fight and make him seem like a shooter.
But they did it well, and because Taz had that low base and looked like that physical specimen until they put him on Raw, and Lawler said, "I got socks taller than this guy," and that was you can't. But there was a lot of real life fucking rivalry between those companies going into play. But I'll tell you, Tommy Rogers, talk about the Fantastics. Tommy Rogers was a hell of an amateur wrestler, and not a lot of people knew that. But he could stretch your fucking ass.
Well, he had done amateur wrestling with Buzz Sawyer, right? Yeah,
well, that's Buzz Sawyer. Allegedly, he told Tommy he was training him. I think he collected some money from Tommy, I believe, is the way the story goes. I don't know all the details, so I won't malign the dead any further.
I was going even beyond that. Didn't they go to high school together? I thought that they were on the same wrestling team. Yeah,
I think may have. Yes.
And then Buzz, I think I could be wrong, but I think he got kicked off the team for punching the coach, which sounds about right. That
sounds about right.
Yeah.
But I got Tommy in a sugar hold one time. Hello, William Harding. We were bored one night in Houma, Louisiana, where we're in that cinder block fucking holding cell that they used as the heel locker room, right? And no windows, and the only door goes out into the building, so you can't even go out in the parking lot just to get air or anything. You're just in this place. And it's a 6-man with me and the Midnight Express against Hacksaw Duggan and the Fantastics. And fucking Dennis says, "Come here, let me show you something." And he showed me how to get the sugar hold on, and he said, "I'll stop Tommy and fucking get him down and tag you in, and before he knows what you're doing, see if you can get this on him." And then, okay. Well, fucking Dennis stops him and slams him and then tags me, and I come in, and instead of putting the boots to him real quick like I usually do so he can bow up and chase me out, I slipped in down real quick and got the sugar hold on him, and he looked up at me and he said, "All right, shooter, what now?" I said, I don't know, because if I let him out, then he's going to have to whip me, but I don't know what else to do. But he legitimately, I had him in the sugar because he let me, because he didn't know it was coming. But
what did you do? What did you end up doing?
I let him go and ran and tagged back out before he could kick my ass. Because we didn't call shit, but the first time we'd seen them that day was when they rang the bell to start the match. We were in opposite locker rooms. They didn't know what the fuck we were thinking. We just called it on the fly. Nobody noticed.
If some shit was going down in Smoky Mountain, who was your guy in the locker room you would have gone to?
Well, it's at what time period and involving who. I mean, if somebody was doing some shit they shouldn't be doing, if Bullet Bob Armstrong was there, they probably would have had enough respect not to do it. As far as Tracy Smothers, if you want somebody to back you up and would need to be killed probably with a blunt instrument over the head to stop him, Tracy had guts. But I'll tell you, Bobby Blaze trained with the Malenkos and had a pretty good idea of what was going on. And he might have been in a wrestling match. He might have been my designated shooter if the Poffos came in and tried to challenge anybody $10,000 to a turkey sandwich.
Think about it. He got trained while the great Malenko and Carl Gotch just sat back and watched. So,
yeah.
I mean, he was in the right room to stretch someone.
And once again, nobody would have thought that.
Yeah.
But up and down the roster, if you were talking about, because I had a group of workers, whether the Heavenly Bodies, the Rock and Roll Express, the Dirty White Boy, Tracy, Candido, and Candido was a strong fucker. You weren't gonna push him around, but he was a worker. All of those guys were great workers, but they weren't strong on, collegiate backgrounds at the time.
You always hear that Robert Gibson could really handle himself. Where did that reputation come from?
And actually that's the thing is because remember I said the connection with guys down south in the old days? Robert Gibson learned from his older brother, Ricky, who learned from guys like the fucking, Spider Galentos, the goddamn South. And all of those guys that knew all of those hook and holes that they would fuck around with in the locker room or in the car or whatever. But yeah, Hoot learned a lot of shit by the time he was even in the business because Ricky had started fucking 6, 7, 8 years before him. And down in Alabama, Billy Spears and all of those old timers, Cowboy Bob Kelly used to be around that area, Don Fargo, they knew all kinds of shit. The Southern kids were farther advanced in terms of the old fashioned shit.
What year did Ricky break in?
Well, he was on top here with Lawler in 74, and I know he was in Atlanta being used well in 72 and 73, and I think he started probably in the Pensacola, Mississippi area before that, so 70, 71. He was as good in the ring in Ricky Gibson in 1974 against Lawler as any babyface that I saw that whole decade. His athletic ability, he was the first guy I ever saw do a missile drop kick off the top turnbuckle. Just because he could, when he would chase the manager, he would run through the ring and the manager would, dive out through the ropes and Ricky would jump over the top rope and land on both feet on the floor and still be running. Or he'd run up the turnbuckles and jump over the post, take the highest backdrop. They were doing vertical suplexes. He had been to Atlanta and caught on some of that cutting edge shit and was applying his athleticism to it. And that was when he was in shape. He hadn't hurt his back. He hadn't blown his knee. He didn't have the car wreck. He was insane. And Ricky that year, besides Lawler, I think Ricky Gibson was number 3 on the 1974 Memphis Mid-South Coliseum sellout list. Lawler had more, obviously, and Fargo was second. But Ricky Gibson, I think, sold out 3 or 4 times with Lawler. And of course, he was in the program with Fargo, so Fargo was in his corner, and et cetera. But he got over better than any young new babyface did in Tennessee during that middle part of the decade.
Hey, Jim, I forgot about the original question about great shooters. I got the answer. Nia Jax.
Okay, one more thing before we go. Folks. Fuck, it ain't ballet. I think she even tweeted something to the effect of, we don't deliver fucking mail, folks. Shit happens. I watched a slow motion clip that was highlighted so that you could see what was going on of that punch that she threw to, I guess, the Becky Lynch girl. And I didn't mean to say that condescendingly, but I don't know her personally. I was trying to think, is that her name, Becky Lynch? Yes. She had an open fist. It was a working punch. And actually, it would have been something that probably she would have got yelled at in years prior because you could see a lot of daylight in that fist. But she turned around and threw an unclenched, just kind of loose fist directly into the bridge of that girl's fucking nose because she was firing and there was a girl coming and she, bam, shit happens. I've seen that happen a million times. I've been on the other end of a couple of those. Not thankfully to have nose broken. And there's elbows and there's shit that happens when you follow through. When people are swinging and it's a wild schmoz, Donnybrook in the fucking ring, somebody's going to catch something. But that's the kind of injury that used to happen on a regular basis in the wrestling business. A black eye, or boy, I caught it in the nose, or goddamn Jesus Christ, somebody split my eyebrow open, or boom, that elbow in the side of the fucking jaw I didn't know was coming. They didn't have spinal fusions. They didn't have goddamn traction. They didn't have halos. They didn't have guys, having these career-ending injuries of various kinds in the spinal and the neck and the whole 9 yards, much less a bunch of long, ACL knee surgeries. The damage that these guys are doing to each other these days is much more structural and longer lasting and more debilitating, because they take so many risks and the shit is planned out, but it's bigger moves. In the old days, it was more of a simulated fight, snatch and grab on the go in a lot of cases, and guys regularly got punched in the fucking face. But they could work, and of course nobody knew anything about concussions, and that still is a pretty good potato to break somebody's nose, but it's a girl's nose, for heaven's sake. I'm willing to believe that Becky Lynch, this may be sexist, but I'm willing to believe that Becky Lynch's nose probably breaks a little easier than Brock Lesnar's, just comparing the two of them. But that shit used to happen all the time, and it ain't ballet, and people get over it. And if you're reckless on a regular basis, you start getting receipts from people and shit like that. But I'd take that any day over, once again, neck surgeries and spinal fusions and fucking, years off of work from, having shit reattached to you surgically. It's just, it's too much.
So to the people out there, and I know you probably have seen it, who have been saying on social media, she should be fired. She didn't look. She was careless. She turned around. She hit someone, and of course she hurt someone, and of course she hurt her because she was careless. What do you say to those people? Do you think she should be fired, or how do you deal with this?
Well, is this a pattern? And I saw somebody else tweeted a clip saying, well, look, she gave another girl a shoulder breaker and it kind of dropped her on her head.
I did see that.
And that pissed me off more. But she's green. That's the problem with a lot of the talent now that's being pushed is they're still fairly green as relates to the experience level of days gone by. And plus they're trying to hurry and get more shit in, and especially on TV when they've only got an allotted amount of time and they get excited. And so if it becomes a pattern, yes, somebody needs to tell her, hey, slow the fuck down, especially because you're bigger than everybody else. But no, from one fucking punch to the bridge of the nose, I don't think she should be terminated and exiled forever. But like I said, I'm more concerned about people getting dropped on their head. And that's more careless than punches flying around everywhere. But good heavens.
See, a lot of people think she gets a free pass because she's The Rock's cousin.
Well, I'm sure that she got a good look-see because of that, but I don't think they're going to allow her to go around hospitalizing people on a regular basis, regardless of who she's related to. So I would think, and once again, I think a lot of it comes down these days to people rushing and trying to get I'm not saying get all unplanned shit in, but trying to get their shit in, especially when I've been there. When you think you got 8 minutes on Raw and they tell you when you're going through the curtain, you got 4.5. Some people just cut some shit out, but a lot of other people try to do everything that they've said just in half the time, and that leads to mistakes. But I saw Ernie Ladd hold a couple of people down. Hercules Hernandez was one of them one time, and I think Dr. Death may have been another one when he had turned heel. Or no, he was still a babyface because Ernie was a heel, and Ernie just held him in the corner to turn him because I could see Ernie saying something to him, and there was shit going on, and boom, 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 and Doc was real green at that point, and finally Ernie backed him up in the corner and turned his back and put his big, massive back into Doc's chest and grabbed the top rope with his left hand, the top rope with his right hand, and leaned over backwards and said, now we're going to stay here until you start listening to me. And he wouldn't let him out. You're going to slow down and start listening to me. And I was okay. And then they went back out and started doing their thing. It's, fuck. I didn't see a reckless, careless disintent there. Just going too fast and swinging at a lot of shit. What else can see? I'm taking up now for the girls even. That's pretty good, huh? When old man, old fart Jim Cornette even takes up for girl wrestling. I'm taking up for all wrestling, the way it should be, and the way we like it.
Mildred Burke would be proud of you.
Mildred Burke would be proud. All right, well, we're going to close this episode of the Jim Cornette Experience, which was not nearly as hilarious as I thought it might be going into it. But ladies and gentlemen, we'll try again next week, and next week will be our Turkey Day edition, where we'll talk turkey with you. But in the meantime, as you know, the Cult of Cornette membership certificates are available, folks. Say it along with me, Cult of Cornette members out there. We pledge allegiance to the leader of the mighty Cult of Cornette and to the pro wrestling for which he stands. No blow-up dolls, dick spots, or dance routines with blood, sellouts, and shoot angles for all. I can't say any more than that. Folks, for Brian, the proprietor of the French Toast Chapeau, or Chateau, or put that French toast in your hat and wear it. How about that? Until next week, folks, for more Jim Cornette Experience. Thank you. Fuck you. Bye-bye, everybody. Oh, me.